Mantana stands for churning. It is the churning of the minds to bring out the Amrita, that is the nectar of self-realization, which is in line with our Sanatana Dharma. Mantana brings out vibrant intellectual conversation through public discourse to strengthen Bharata and aims to become one important voice in the formation of informed nationalist public opinion. Mantana is present in almost all districts of Karnataka. Mantana Mysuru has been active for over a decade and brings in the finest thinkers to engage with the citizens of Mysuru through talk shows, book launches, discussions, and debates. Some of our recent talk shows were by Shri Prakash Bedwadi, Shri J. Sai Deepak, Shri Sandeep Balakrishna, and Professor Nandan Prabhu.
Good evening. First of all, thank you to the wonderful team of Mantana, Shri Harish ji, Shri Vasudev Bhatt ji, Srimati Padmavati Bhatt ji, and all of you who have assembled here for this very important topic today. So to begin with, let me quote a very representative verse by Bhartrhari. Dikkala dyanavacchinnananta chinmatra murtaye svanubhutyekamanaya namashantaya tejase. Om Tat Sat. So, first of all, it is always my great honor, privilege, and delight to address this gathering. This is, in fact, my second appearance here on the Mantana platform at Mysore. And my heartfelt gratitude once again goes to Shri Harish ji and his wonderful team for putting this together. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you in the audience. The subject of today's session is not only of great importance, but it's also something that has become a crisis that has to be addressed now if we are serious about our survival as a Hindu society. On the larger plane, today's subject is also vital to the understanding of the history and culture of the Hindu civilization itself. Now, I'm sure all of you are broadly aware of the fact that the ancient and unbroken institution of Hindu temples has today reached a tipping point, that is, it has reached a situation of do or die. But to frame the entire problem in one line, Hindu temples are facing an existential threat. And you know better than me that especially over the last 10 or so years, several initiatives have been taken by private organizations and private individuals to reclaim Hindu temples from government control because of systemic issues such as widespread corruption, massive loot of temple money, poor maintenance, and generally speaking, a complete breakdown of the whole system. And on the other side, we also know that mosques and churches are completely exempt from any kind of government scrutiny. They are accountable to nobody. Now, one major outcome of the activism for freeing Hindu temples from government control is the kind of details that have emerged of the horrible extent of the rot that has been going on for what, at least half a century, if not more. Now, the awareness and pressure from all these activists has in fact yielded some good results. It is now common to see a board in all government-controlled temples, especially in Karnataka, and I'll read it out. The donations put in the Hindu by the Bhaktas will be used only for the purpose of maintaining and developing the temple and not for any other purpose. ಅಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೂ ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಅಂತ ಅವರೇ ಒಪ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹಾಗಾಯಿತು. So the Karnataka government has also announced, I think in March or April this year, that a law will be enacted soon in order to liberate temples from government control, which is a good step in a way. But the problem is not just liberating Hindu temples from government control. It has far deeper and far more prolonged roots. Now, passing a law or a legislation is basically a political solution to a civilizational problem. Government control of Hindu temples is not just yes, politics is one facet of that, but the roots of this problem are actually civilizational, and as such, this problem has to be addressed using civilizational methods. This is the reason I have given the title today's topic as liberating Hindu temples from government control, a 360-degree view, and we have to essentially approach this urgent problem in a calm and dispassionate manner for a simple reason, straightforward reason. Now, each time we mention, the question of Hindu temples, whether liberating it or, debates on that, it is a very emotionally charged topic for obvious reasons. And it evokes a lot of passion, and decisions, taken when we are emotionally charged might not be sound in the long term. This we can verify even in our personal lives. Each time you take a decision when you're angry or, extremely happy, you never know what the outcome will be, say 2 or 3 months later or a few years later. And so to take this 360-degree view, we first need to understand the foundations of what is known as the temple culture and tradition. To do that, we need to go into the history of Hindu temples. We need to grasp the practical aspects of how our temples have functioned throughout this extraordinary period of history. And so accordingly, I have divided my lecture into the following broad categories. First, we'll look at the philosophical, spiritual, and devotional dimensions of Hindu temples. Then we'll understand the central role that our temples have played in our society throughout history, how they were one of the most powerful drivers of the economy. Next, we'll use some concrete examples from real life, recorded, available, verifiable examples from history that show how our temples were being managed throughout our history, which is a period of a minimum of 1,000 years, one entire millennium. And then we'll also understand some reasons for the downfall of this temple culture and the decline of the Hindu temple as a great binding force that kept the Hindu society united for so long. And finally, we'll conclude with some brief indicators about the whole situation that we are facing today. And as I indicated, my intent today here is not to offer concrete solutions. It's going to be very arrogant on my part to even attempt something on those lines. Because like I said, the problem is way too complex and there is no one solution. And perhaps if we evolve some kind of a solution in haste, it might actually give rise to a problem that we had not anticipated today. In reality, the entire Hindu community should come together as a whole and evolve a solution through debates, through discussions, and in a calm and reasoned fashion. So with that introduction, I think we can get into today's session. We'll begin that with a very, very basic question. What exactly is a temple? Anybody? Quickly, 10 seconds. Anybody in the audience? Feel free to answer. Okay. 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 All good answers. So, what are the philosophical foundations? That is where we have to begin our investigation. But before we get into that, here is a very, very simple way to understand it. I'm sure all of you in this, most of you in this room can understand Kannada. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಇದು ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೇ ಇಂಪ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ಬರೋದು. ದೇವಸ್ಥಾನ ಅಥವಾ ದೇವಸ್ಥಾನದ ಕೆಲಸ ಅಂತ ಏನಂತೀವಿ, ಅದು ಎಲ್ಲರ ಕೆಲಸ. ಮತ್ತು ಯಾವುದು ಎಲ್ಲರ ಕೆಲಸ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೋ ಅದು ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಬೇಕಾಗೋಲ್ಲ. ಮತ್ತು ದೇವಸ್ಥಾನದ ಕೆಲಸ, ಆ ಇಡೀ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ನಡೆಯೋದು ಭಕ್ತಿಯಿಂದ, ಶ್ರದ್ಧೆಯಿಂದ, ಒಂದು ಅರ್ಪಣೆ ಮನೋಭಾವದಿಂದ, ಕಾಣದ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ದೈವಕ್ಕೆ ಅಂತರಂಗದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ನಾವು ಸಮರ್ಪಿಸಿಕೊಂಡು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ತಕ್ಕಂತೆ ಬಹಿರಂಗದಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೆದುಕೊಳ್ತಿದಲ್ಲ, ಆ ನಡವಳಿಕೆ ಮೇಲೇನೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಇಡೀ ದೇವಾಲಯ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ನಿಂತಿರೋದು. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಸಿಂಪ್ಲೆಸ್ಟ್ ವೇ ಯು ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ what is the foundations of an institution called Hindu temples. Now, to get into a few more details, without doubt, temples are one of the central, if not the central feature of the Hindu civilization, its culture, philosophy, spirituality, devotion, art, painting, literature, sculpture, music, and dance. It is really difficult to imagine Hindu Dharma without the institution of temples. And in fact, our temples are the embodiment of one of the finest, deepest, grandest, and the most profound expressions of the human spirit of awe, wonderment, and a timeless yearning for spirituality, philosophy, art, and creativity, all of which are engraved in stone, wood, and other mediums. The inner longing for the spiritual can never be fully expressed because it transcends space and time. Now, let's go back to really ancient history at the dawn of the human civilization. When we consider that period, we notice various forms of temples in all the early civilizations, including Minoan civilization, Greece, Rome, Egypt, Maya civilization, Chinese, Inca, and most certainly Bharatiya civilization. Here, in all these temple structures, we notice precisely the same spirit of yearning for the spiritual. In fact, the etymology of the word, that is how the word temple was derived, that etymology can be traced to the Latin term templum. Templum means a shrine, a sacred space, an open area meant for augury, and so on. But here's the thing, almost no temple of all those civilizations which roughly began around the time that Hindu civilization began, none of those temples belonging to none of those civilizations have survived today. Not even one. Throughout the world. And why did it happen? At the very first encounter with Christianity and Islam, they were decimated. Okay? But it is also notable that these two prophetic cults, Islam and Christianity, they have a zealous prohibition against what is known as idol worship or But in Islam. So what is notable is that even in these two religions, we have thousands, if not lakhs, of mosques and dargahs and churches and cathedrals and shrines throughout the world. What does it show? This shows, or this represents the triumph of this spiritual longing within all of us. And it overrides the prophetic prohibition against idol worship. Now, coming back to the role, significance, and the eminence of Hindu temples, that will become very, very clear when we regard them in this historical backdrop. And all of you know that the words for the English word temple in Sanskrit and various other Indian languages is Devasthana, Devalaya, Alaya, Mandir, Kovila in Telugu, Koil in Tamil, and so on. And a quick derivation of the etymology of the word Devalaya is as follows. Devasya Alayaha or Devanam Alayaha. This means in English, a place in which light, sport, victory, transaction, prayer, joy, bliss, dream, beauty, and dynamism resides. It is the abode and the sport of the divine that is inside all of us. It is a joy that we derive by celebrating this sport in a physical structure. And so we have already seen, how the temples in non-Hindu cultures were destroyed. But what is the role that our temples played in our cultural history and civilizational history? For example, the English word temple, right? What it means, the other meaning of the word temple is the location that spans two sides of the forehead. This is temple. Madhyadalli hane ide tane, forehead. So it is flat. What it means is that you get a symbolism in your own body that resembles a Yagnavedi. Now, in the Sanatana conception, the entire body itself is regarded as a temple, which is suggested by hundreds of great shlokas, such as Deho Devalaya Prokto Jivo Devas Sanatanaha, Hridayam Tad Vijaniyat Vishwasayatam Mahata, and so on. And So if you regard the entire body as a temple, the feet are the main doors, the reproductive organ is the Dvajastambha, the stomach is the Palipita, the heart is the Navaranga, the neck is the Sukhanasi, and the head is a Garbhagriha. In short, a temple represents and includes all three stages, what are known as taras: Adibhuta, Adidaiva, and Adhyatma, which means the physical, the divine, and the philosophical. But even more fundamentally, the earliest conception of temples, it came from the great Vedic vision which regards the heart as a cave. You have numerous shlokas for that also. Hridayasya nihitam guhayam, hridayam tad vijaniyat, and the Mahanarayana Upanishad, its last portion is known as Gnana Yagna. So we have a beautiful conception of, not only the body as a temple and all the implications of where it finally takes us. Just to summarize that, this is a visualization that in our heart, Parameshwara himself resides as pure knowledge in the form of light, and it should be the aim and the goal of our life to realize this light within. And this vision, it also comes from within us in a deep fashion when we notice that the Moola Murti resides in the Garbhagriha in the temple, which is the heart of any temple, Garbhagriha. So it is not a mere coincidence that when our ancestors realized that, when Islamic armies would come to destroy our temples, and that you can't save it any longer, what was the first thing they used to do? The first thing is, Garbhagrahadalliro Moola Murti tegadu hegadru safety madabeku anta. We have the famous story of Vedanta Deshikar, who took the Ranganatha Swami Murti, Moola Murti from the Garbhagriha in Srirangam and came all the way to Karnataka. So this is, you can see all the links at various levels, right from the philosophical up to the physical and the metaphysical also. So now this rather detailed introduction was necessary because it serves to illustrate the sort of extraordinary foundation which eventually paved the way for the evolution of what can be called the Devalaya or the temple ecosystem. The temple ecosystem is a social and cultural accomplishment. It is a great civilizational peak that is unparalleled anywhere in any culture in human history. The fact that even today, even as we are gathered here, even today, there is a new temple being built or some old temple is being renovated in some corner of India, what does it show? It shows not only the endurance and the longevity of these roots, but it is also great proof that as long as Sanatana Dharma survives in this world, it will invariably find its expressions in temple. Now, from the perspective of what is known as Triguna, or basic attributes, namely Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, a temple is the purest architectural, sculptural, and artistic embodiment of the Sattva Guna. Sattva means balance, equanimity, serenity, and so on. Now, by itself, Sattva Guna does nothing. That is, it does no work, it takes no action, but by its mere existence, it inspires, it motivates, and guides all noble human endeavors spread across different fields. A Devalaya thus becomes a pillar that supports and accommodates and enables the attainment of dharma and fulfilling the various duties and activities related to artha. And in the field of dharma, the temple is the place to perform various acharas, what are known as customs and rituals or ceremonies, like Namakarana, Aksharabhyasa, Vivaha, and so on. And these ceremonies are part of the individual who discharges these duties. And when you look at the same thing, when you juxtapose the same thing to the level of the community, the Devalaya is a place for conducting, mass festivals like mass marriages, utsavas, jatre, Annadanam, and all such other profound celebrations. In fact, not too long ago, the temple was also the place where justice was delivered, and we see this fact even today in Dharmasthala. And on the plane of the Adi Daivika, which is divine or spiritual, we can consider the deity of Vastu Shastra, Vishwakarma. Vishwakarma has 9 children, and I'll read out some names. Okay, 9 sons basically. One was named Malakara, the other was Darukara, Kuvindaka, Kumbhakara, Sutradhara, and others. So, what do these sons represent? What do these names represent? They respectively represent professions: garland maker, carpenter, weaver, potter, sculptor, and so on. And these apart, we also have the farmer, the chef, the messenger, the singer, the artisan, accountant, and numerous other professions. In other words, what we notice in all these cases is that how these professions are sanctified by making them the descendants of a particular god. So that way, every profession had its rightful place, and every professional could make a living through honest work. And so from all this discussion, it is also clear that how all of these professions make up an entire economic system which was birthed, sustained, and supported solely by the institution called the Hindu temple. And it is precisely this that we observe even today in these great temple towns across Bharatavarsha. It could be Kashi, Rameshwaram, Mathura, Kanchipuram, Chidambaram, Tirumala, Tirupati, Madurai, Palani, Pandarapur, Badrinath, Puri, and hundreds of other such temple towns. We can also consider another tangential point out here. Any dhanam or donation or endowment or gift, any dhanam given to a temple would immediately become what is known as devasva, which means it is a property of the temple or the deity of the temple over which nobody, not even the king or the government or even the donor, has a right. As long as this is with me, I am its owner. The moment I donate it to a temple, I cease to have any ownership rights. It could be anybody. The donor could be anybody, from the poorest man to the king. So what this illustrates is a sheer genius of the people, our civilization, which thought about devising such an extraordinary temple system. And Dr. S. Srikanta Shastri, he explains the various aspects of this Devalaya ecosystem in an extremely beautiful manner, and I'll quote some of those words here. Quote, temples occupied a prominent place from the perspective of education, fine arts. It reflected the economic condition of the kingdom. Thus, people had a firm belief and faith in the pious act of donating to temples. Donors included everybody from the king to the most ordinary citizen. Temples were governed and maintained by a duly elected board. They distributed money, food grains, and seeds to farmers from the temple's treasury. Temples were also engaged in money lending activities. They conducted various celebrations like Pakshotsava, Masotsava, Brahmotsava, and they oversaw the distribution of the harvest derived from temple lands. Theatre and dance halls organized dramas and during Utsava days in both Sanskrit and Desha Bhashas. Music and dance recitals offered as seva for the deity immensely enriched all our art forms like classical music, Bharatanatyam, Vastu Shilpa. Moral and spiritual discourses by learned scholars, yatis, and such other pious people were drawn from the Vedic and Puranic literature, thereby instilling and reinforcing dharma among the pilgrims and others who visited the temple. There were also lecture halls for imparting higher education in various subjects, including Veda, Vedanga, medicine, and other subjects by teachers and scholars who were employed by the temple. Students were given free scholarship and boarding and lodging in temples. Massive temples were secure like fortresses, and they contained an abundance of food, grain, water, and other supplies, and provided shelter to refugees during wartime. Because Hindu kings regarded temples as sacred spaces, they deferred harming or spoiling them slightly, even if this caution meant their defeat in war. Temples in island nations like Java, Bali, Sumatra, Burma, and Cambodia were built following the ideals
ideas and the physical plan of various Indian temples. Close quote. So, like with most other aspects of our culture and society, our temples also show a remarkable sense of unbroken continuity and cultural unity, in the sense that they are still a living memory. The majestic Somanath temple, which was rebuilt in 1951, is a superb proof to this inherited tradition of knowledge, traditions, rituals, which were preserved intact even after hundreds of years of repeated destruction and alien Islamic rule in India. Similarly, many of the ancient temple towns have also survived brutal shocks, but they still continue to thrive. They also show the same sense of cultural unbroken continuity. And art forms such as Natya Melas, Harikatha, Yakshagana, Kudiyattam, Kathakali, different other art forms, they are the direct products, if not offshoots, of the same sprawling Devalaya ecosystem. For centuries, unbroken centuries, all these art forms became immensely popular, and they became excellent vehicles for transmitting a beautiful spiritual culture throughout the country. Yav school bekagilla, yav textbook bekagirlilla. So if all these art forms have almost reached extinction today, it is precisely because the protective and nurturing umbrella of the temple ecosystem has been destroyed. One devasthana hoytu andre ಏನೇನೆಲ್ಲ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. So from what we have seen so far, I think it is clear that the Hindu temple was not merely a place for worship, but a complex universe in itself. It was both an ecosystem and an ecology, and like ecology, a delicate balance and order was maintained through countless components which were all interconnected, and although these connections were not always visible in the physical sense. So a slight disturbance in one component will definitely have far-reaching consequences for the entire ecosystem itself. You can take the classic example of different forests which are being destroyed. One species of animal, you kill them all for some reason, and the whole forest itself collapses. We all watch these videos on National Geographic and Discovery Channel. So the same analogy can be applied to the temple ecosystem. So from this, it is also clear that building such a complex temple ecosystem was not the work of one person or one book or one institution, nor did it happen overnight or even in 1 year or even in 10 years. It was a gradual evolution over several centuries, several generations, after passing through innumerable trial and error methods before it reached perfection. And we must keep all these factors in mind before examining the next segment of today's session, what is known as temple management. Now, broadly speaking, two types of temples have existed throughout our history. The first were the temples built by kings and governors and zamindars and wealthy people and other private individuals. The second were the temples built by the entire Hindu community itself. But as far as the management of both of these types of temples go, there were only slight differences, and we'll look at some concrete examples to illustrate the management of both of these types. Now, for temples built by kings, I can think of no better example than the magnificent Brihadishvara temple built by Rajaraja Chola. He is one of the greatest Hindu kings the world has ever seen. For the entire world, Rajaraja Chola was a monarch, he was a king. But as far as he was concerned, he proudly called himself as Shivapada Shekhara, or the servant sitting who places his head at the feet of Shiva. When this king was 67 years old, he left behind an extraordinary system that would ensure that the Brihadishvara temple would remain intact even generations after he passed away. And in fact, Rajaraja Chola did not merely build a grand temple, he actually created a small civilization itself, which in turn incubated a great culture, almost from the scratch. in the final year of his rule, Rajaraja Chola, he made elaborate and visionary endowments. All these endowments were in perpetuity, right? He made these endowments for preserving the extensive and expensive daily routine needed to merely run the Brihadishwara temple. So he himself was the largest donor to the temple. He gave enormous quantities of gold, diamonds, pearls, necklaces, rubies, coins, and all sorts of precious stones. The second largest donor to this temple was his elder sister. Her name is Parantakan Kundavai Alvar. The third largest donors included his other queens. And I'll just give a sample of the kind of arrangements he made for the upkeep and management of the temple. He gave hundreds and thousands of vessels and utensils made of gold and silver of different sizes and shapes, each of them meant for a specific purpose to be utilized by the temple. For example, Anna Mado Tapleಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಚಿನ್ನದಾದರೂ ಅನ್ನನೇ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ. So these are all written down in inscriptions. So from his personal treasury, Rajaraja gifted various items of gold weighing about 490 pounds. This was followed by a jewelry collection which was worth 10,200 kasu, which means real gold coins. After that, then he also gave different silverware which weighed about 600 pounds. His sister Kundavai, she donated gold that weighed about 10,000 kalanju. One kalanju is about 8 grams. And she also gave other jewelry and utensils which were valued at about 18,000 kasu. And his other queens, ministers and officials, other top-ranking government people, they also donated money to the temple according to their capacity. And the land belonging to the Brihadishwara temple were clearly marked from neighboring lands by erecting strong boundary stones. And these boundary stones, it's so beautiful. These boundary stones, they had the distinctive signature of the respective presiding deity. Shulam in the case of Shiva, trident, Trishula, Chakra or discus for Vishnu. And although Rajaraja Chola was a Shiva Bhakta, he also patronized Vishnu Bhaktas, so that punctures that other great secular balloon of Shaiva and Vaishnava hostilities, which is largely exaggerated. He also presented an exquisite Vigraha of Sri Mahavishnu to the Brihadishwara temple, and he got in sculptors from various regions, to carve out Vishnu Murtis and even Buddhist sculptures for decorations in the Vimana of the temple, the tower of the temple, and as well as the basement. After this, he endowed vast tracts of agricultural land spread over hundreds of villages throughout his extensive dominions, including Sri Lanka. ಶ್ರೀಲಂಕಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಎಂಡೌಮೆಂಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡಿಂದ ಬರೋ ಇನ್ಕಮ್ ಬೃಹದೀಶ್ವರ ಸ್ವಾಮಿ ದೇವಸ್ಥಾನಕ್ಕೆ ಪೂಜೆಗೆ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ವಿನಿಯೋಗ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. And these lands at that time they yielded an annual income of 58,000 kasu of paddy plus a cash income of 1,100 kasu. After this, he built two long streets named Talicheris. Talicheri, roughly translated, it means the street of the temple. The northern and southern streets, it ran from east to west, and he had built homes for 400 dancing families. All these artists, they were flown in from various parts of the Chola territory and even outside, and they were settled in these temple streets forever. As long as their lineage carried on the dance, Nritya Seve Martha iddadashtu, those houses and those endowments belong to these dancing families. And not only that, he also gave these families, apart from the houses, he granted one veli. One veli is 6.5 acres of agricultural land. And that land yielded an annual income of 100 kalam. One column is equal to 125 kgs of paddy. ಈ ಥರ ಅರೇಂಜ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. In turn, 180 such shares were set aside for the maintenance of 215 male servants of the temple who practiced different professions such as dance master, musicians, drummers, instrumentalists, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, barbers, tailors, accountants, flower makers, to name just a few. And of these, 3 musicians were especially appointed to sing Sanskrit hymns, which were known as Aryam, and 4 musicians were dedicated to sing Tamil kritis composed in honor of Brihadishwara. Rajaraja Chola also set up a mela or a musical troupe comprising 48 musicians, including singers and accompanies. So, of this, you had 2 drummers for reciting the Tiruppadiyam, and all of these people, this musical troupe or the mela troupe, they were given 3 kurunni or 24 measures of paddy per day. Seru anta. So 24 ಸೇರು ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ. And then Rajaraja Chola formalized this whole complex arrangement by constituting all of these professionals into a self-regulating corporation which was an independent body. Okay? And it had the full freedom to take all decisions concerning whatever, settling disputes or decisions concerning their own families or whatever. And this corporation again was for perpetuity, and according to Rajaraja Chola's orders, if any one person or family in this community died or migrated, the descendants or a relative would take the place of the dead person or the migrated person in the temple mela. Or if the defendants was, unfit or incompetent, the corporation was free to appoint a suitable person from outside. The last name of all members of the corporation was Shiva. And this is extraordinary, and this is just one glorious example, because we have the details are so rich. You can find literally hundreds of such inscriptions. And after his death, Rajaraja's descendants not only continued this system, but they also made further improvements to it. His son, Rajendra Chola, he made an additional donation sometime in 1033 or 1034, which records a generous grant of 2,000 columns. 24 columns is equal to 1 quintal. So he made a grant of 2,000 columns of paddy per annum, dedicated to the disciples and disciples of disciples, Shishya Prashishyaru antivala avrige, of a great scholar and a monk named Sarvashiva Pandita. He was the main archaka of the Brihadishwara temple. And this grant is extremely brilliant because its brilliance lies in the following fact. These disciples could be residing anywhere in the entire Bharatavarsha, not necessarily within the Chola territory. The disciples could hail from anywhere in India. So it reads as follows: they could reside anywhere in Bharatavarsha, be it the Arya Desha, the Madhya Desha, or the Gauda Desha. Arya Desha is Aryavarta, Madhya Desha is Middle India, Gauda Desha is the Bengal region. So when you say Gauda Desha, it included parts of Assam, Bengal, undivided Bengal, that is Bangladesh, and large parts of Orissa. Rajendra Chola also placed this whole grant under the trusteeship of the Shaiva Acharyas of this great Pandit, Sarvashiva Acharya, whom I just mentioned. Now, think for a moment, think of all the implications of just this one grant. Which government, which law, which legislation, which policy written by IAS officers can conceive of such a thing or bring about this kind of national cultural unity? Which university teaches you this kind of thing? Now, if this was Rajendra Chola, his son, Rajendra Chola II, he also did something extraordinary. He not only continued this great tradition, but he also had an abiding reverence towards his grandfather. He made a grant in 1058. So this grant gave a daily allowance of paddy from the treasury of the Brihadishwara temple to a troupe of actors who had to perform a drama titled Rajarajeshwara Nataka. This was performed during the Vaikasi festival, Vaishakha Masa, typically in May or June in Tamil Nadu, within the temple premises. And all the available historical records, it tells us that this drama, Rajarajeshwara Nataka, it presented the scenes depicting the story of the construction of the Brihadishwara temple, narrated in a popular format so that it appealed to the masses. And I've read somewhere that even now during the festival in the Vaikasi month, Vaishakha Masa, the same drama is enacted in the temple on a platform near the main eastern gate entrance into the courtyard of the temple. I'm not sure if they perform this play now. But what is even more incredible than this is that as late as 1802, okay, that's just 200 years from now, the Tanjavur Maratha ruler Sarfoji Rao, who was also a contemporary of Tyagaraja Swami, he took the Brihadishwara temple back from the British, performed the punyaha or purifying rituals, and reconsecrated it. So this is how you preserve cultural memory. And I think this provides us sufficient details on how Hindu temples had been managed in the past. We have seen concrete examples of how this management system functioned in practice. And the same system more or less applied to temples owned by the Hindu community as a whole. And in this case, a temple board was in charge of the management. It was sometimes known as the Mahasabha, and it consisted representatives from all communities in the Hindu society. There was an office of the Sthanika, and depending on the period of Indian history and the place where we are talking about, depending on these two factors, Sthanikas performed different roles. They sometimes functioned as the heads of the temple, sometimes they were accountants of the temple, and at other times they were in charge of the supervision of various pujas and sevas and so on. They had to send regular reports to the king about the functioning of the temple, and temples were also allowed to have their own treasury, and the income generated by the temple had to be primarily used for its maintenance, upkeep, and development. And temples also performed banking functions. For example, they could lend money to private parties at an interest rate that fell anywhere between 9 to 12%. And in times of crisis like floods and famine and drought, temples would provide relief measures, and the temple boards or these Mahasabhas, they in turn reported to the village assembly. Now we come to an interesting sidelight of today's topic. It might be surprising to learn that the Vijayanagara Empire had nationalized all the temples under its territories. What is today known as, government control. And every minute activity of temples were strictly monitored. And this was for a very, very basic fundamental reason. This was for the fact that the Vijayanagara Empire was founded with the explicit purpose of safeguarding Hindu Dharma in South India, and everything that fell in this domain was heavily regulated just so that it could be protected. So the temple building activity that occurred during the Vijayanagara period was truly prolific. Old temples were restored and new ones were built throughout the kingdom, throughout South India. And in fact, if we take a look at any temple of the Vijayanagara period, what is the first thing you notice? What you notice is that they are all built almost like massive fortifications. They have towers that touch the sky. The walls are massive, large and long. They have huge compounds, and this is because it was a defensive structure. These are all defensive measures. And the Hindu community had learned the lesson well that temples were the first targets during any Muslim invasions, and they had to be therefore defended well in advance. And this so-called government control over Hindu temples in Vijayanagara, it was actually meant to protect and preserve the temples. And likewise, Vijayanagara kings also gave generous patronage to temples built by private parties, but they had the final authority in case of disputes and arguments. So if this is a picture of temple management historically, we should also see the picture on the other side, not from the management side, but from the side of the Hindu community or the Hindu society. Now, once again, it might come as a surprise to learn that the Hindu society was a temple-centric society. In both large cities and towns and villages, social life entirely revolved around a temple. In fact, building a temple for the Grama Devata was a mandatory part in the founding of every new village. Let me give you a small data point in this connection. Now, after every harvest season, once the crops were harvested, the farmer would first deliver 1/6 of that year's harvest to the temple's godown as his sacred offering. Only after this he would measure the remaining harvest. ಬಂದಿದ್ದು ಮೊದಲು ದೇವರು ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಆಮೇಲೆ ಲೆಕ್ಕ ಹಾಕೋದು ಅಂತ. Then the temple would divide all these offerings for various activities such as funding schools and educational institutions, feeding pilgrims, doing annadhanam, conducting mass marriages, providing food during festivals, maintaining hospitals. The list is nearly endless. You name any social or community activity, you would see the role of a temple in that. And the same thing pretty much was also applicable to people who practiced various professions. For example, garland makers were required to supply a certain number of garlands to the deity each day, depending on the flower that was available in that season. ಆ ಲೆವೆಲ್ ಡೀಟೇಲ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ನೀವು ಹೂ ಮಾರಾಟ ಇರೋರು ಹೂವು ಕಟ್ಟೋರಾಗಿದ್ದರೆ ನೀನು ಮಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತಲ್ಲ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಸೀಸನಲ್ಲೂ ಬೆಳೆಯೋದಿಲ್ಲ ಮಲ್ಲಿಗೆ. ಸೊ ಯಾವ ಸೀಸನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಹೂವು ಇದು ಬಿಡುತ್ತೋ ಅವಾಗ ಅದನ್ನು ಡೊನೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಂತ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಲೈಕ್ವೈಸ್ ಆಯಿಲ್ ಪ್ರೊಡ್ಯೂಸರ್ಸ್, ಗಾಣಿಗರು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ವಲ್ಲ, so they would also supply a stipulated quantity of oil to the temple for various purposes, for cooking, for lamps and other things. And weavers, carpenters, stonemasons, cattle owners, blacksmiths, tailors, everyone contributed in their own fashion according to their own capacity to the temples. And in fact, Nalli Silks is a famous silk brand. So Nalli Silk store based in Chennai, till date they supply the vastram to Sri Venkateshwara Swami in Tirumala. Why do they do it? What makes them do it? There was also a legal or a judicial side to the Hindu temple ecosystem, and I can offer you only a small glimpse into it in the space of this session. This deals with punishments which were awarded typically in criminal cases like stealing, assault, and cheating and so on. One invariable component of this punishment was to ask the guilty party to donate cows to the local temple, or to supply money for oil to the temple, lamps basically, or to do labor for digging wells, for maintaining tanks attached to the temple. And in many cases, the guilty criminal had to visit the temple every single day. He had to stand before the deity, confess his crime every single day, and do prayashchitta by lighting lamps in the temple. And now with this, I think we can come to the last portion of today's topic. From the discussion so far, I think it is pretty clear that no part of the Hindu society was exempt from participating in the Devalaya ecosystem. And in fact, the Hindu temple ecosystem flourished in an unbroken condition precisely because everybody considered it their sacred duty to contribute to it. This is exactly what I meant when I said we have to take a 360-degree view. But above all, our temples prospered, they were in a flourishing condition because the king or the ruler or the government, whatever name you want to give it, they were personally invested in the temples out of a profound sense of bhakti, shraddha and dharma. Many of our kings, in fact, died protecting temples. Many of them surrendered their thrones to invaders only in order to protect temples. Take the case of Sri Chamundeshwari temple here in Mysore. It was in a thriving condition for centuries only because the Wadayar dynasty took a sacred interest in it. Now it is under the so-called Muzerai department, and I'm sure all of you in this room are better informed about its pathetic condition than I am. In other words, what we have done is that we have replaced sanctity with a faceless democracy, which would have been fine, but do we have enough number of politicians or ministers or bureaucrats who, like earlier kings, display their bhakti openly, if at all they have it? So the situation at the level of the Hindu society is also pretty discouraging. I don't mean to disparage anybody here, but this is the reality that all of us can verify. We definitely have large number of Hindus, going on Tirtha Yatras, visiting various temples, and that number is growing every year. But the fundamental question is this: is the temple the very center of the Hindu society today? Okay? In fact, a lot of Hindus, educated Hindus, take pride in saying that I am a spiritual person, I don't go to temples. So you see 360-degree circle in tirgi, melidid kelagade bandide chakra. Are Hindus consciously and dutifully participating in the temple ecosystem as they used to do historically? And I've given you many examples so far, which brings me to my last point. Now, the recent spurt of activism for freeing Hindu temples from government control, it primarily originated in Tamil Nadu. This is a state where the government actively works to, obliterate Hindu temples. In other words, successive governments in Tamil Nadu, they were involved in persecution of our temples. These are not just taking away donations or stealing money. These are acts of persecution that these guys still do today. So the case for liberating temples there from government control is pretty strong, and to some degree, the same thing can be said about Karnataka, but there are also enough number of cases in which the management of private temples here in Karnataka and elsewhere as well, they quarrel among each other and hand over the temple to the government. And then, when it is too late, when they realize what they've lost, then the same people who gave it away to the government complain in the same breath that the same temple has to be liberated from the government. How does that work? What explains it? And I believe that, one of the important roots of this topic today of liberating Hindu temples from government control, one of the important roots of this problem lies here, and it all comes back to the same thing that I had mentioned in the beginning of my lecture. Devasthanada kelasa, ellar kelasa, yavadu ellar kelasano, adu yargu bekagodilla. With that, I conclude my submission today, and I once again offer my heartfelt gratitude to Sri Harish, to the entire team, to the fine folks at Manthana, and most of all, to all of you in the audience for giving me a patient hearing. Om Tat Sat.